Michael Johnson, a seasoned tech executive, had become accustomed to the rigor of high-stakes business travel. Today, as he boarded his flight to New York, he was mentally preparing for the upcoming merger presentation that could significantly alter his company's future. With his confident stride and carefully curated appearance, Michael entered the first-class cabin of the airline, his platinum status tag gleaming on his luggage. As he settled into his seat, Michael couldn't help but reflect on the journey ahead, one that could set new standards for his business and his industry. Little did he know that this flight would serve as the beginning of a personal and professional transformation that would echo across an entire industry. As the flight took off, Michael tried to relax, focusing on the merger details in his tablet, but his peace was abruptly shattered when a flight attendant named Jennifer approached his seat. There was something off about her demeanor. She hesitated before greeting him, her forced smile barely masking the skepticism in her eyes. When she placed his meal in front of him, a single slice of dry bread and a small cup of water, Michael was stunned. Her remark, "This meal fits," was barely audible, but it carried an undeniable sting. The words weren't just a comment about the meal, they were a reflection of something deeper, a racially charged prejudice that, though subtle, was powerful in its own right. Jennifer walked away quickly, her smile never reaching her eyes, and Michael was left staring at the humiliating meal in front of him. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted uncomfortably as other passengers began to notice the oddity of the situation. Michael knew better than to react impulsively. Years of navigating the corporate world had taught him how to maintain composure in moments like this. But beneath his calm exterior, the incident left a simmering sense of indignation that was hard to ignore. This wasn't just about an oversight or a mistake, it was about something far more ingrained. Michael realized that this was more than a minor inconvenience. It was a direct reflection of the systemic biases that persisted in the airline industry. The subtle mistreatment he had just experienced was not isolated. It was part of a larger unspoken narrative that Michael was now determined to expose. As the flight continued, Michael quietly took out his phone, documenting the incident in real time. He captured photos of the bread and water, the inattentive flight attendants, and even the dismissive way he was treated when he attempted to ask for a proper meal. Michael understood the importance of having evidence to back up his claims. This wasn't just a fleeting injustice, it was part of a pattern that he needed to bring to light. With his extensive background in technology, he knew the value of documentation, especially when dealing with issues as sensitive as discrimination. Michael's phone buzzed with a message from his assistant Harper, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It was about how the airline had treated him, and possibly many others, simply because of assumptions based on his appearance. By the time the plane began its descent into New York, Michael had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this go. The slight from the flight attendants was not something he could simply forget or ignore. It was a stark reminder of the prejudice that still pervaded many industries, including the airline sector. He had been quietly collecting evidence throughout the flight, knowing that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The power of one moment. The bread and water incident would soon ripple out to touch a far greater audience. Michael knew that this event had the potential to spark a conversation that would force the airline industry and potentially many others to confront the biases that were so deeply embedded in their cultures. As the flight touched down and Michael prepared to disembark, he sent the photos and videos he had taken to Harper with a simple message: "Make sure you're watching this flight." He knew that this wasn't just about him being treated unfairly. It was about the responsibility he now carried to bring this injustice to light. The journey ahead was no longer just about business. It was about taking a stand, using his influence and platform to hold the airline accountable for its actions. Michael could feel the weight of what he was about to do, but it was a weight he had grown used to carrying. As he exited the plane, he was ready. The catalyst for change had been set into motion. As the flight ascended into the sky, Michael Johnson settled into his first-class seat, preparing for the hectic days ahead. His mind was focused on the critical merger he was about to finalize, but he couldn't shake the anticipation that this business trip would be another routine travel experience. However, everything shifted the moment the flight attendants began their pre-service rounds. One of them, a woman named Jennifer, approached Michael with a forced smile. He noticed her hesitation as she placed the meal in front of him, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. The plate she set before him contained nothing more than a single slice of dry bread and a cup of water. A sharp, sarcastic remark from Jennifer cut through the silence. "This meal fits you." Ah, the words stung, though Michael kept his composure. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers subtly shift in his direction, though most of them tried to look away quickly. His heart sank as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just a poorly timed mistake. This was blatant disrespect, a clear example of racial bias that Michael had faced countless times before in his career. The irony was not lost on him. A man who had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, securing multi-million-dollar deals, was being served an insult in the form of a meager meal. Michael glanced at the other passengers around him. Some seemed uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. The uncomfortable silence seemed to grow as Jennifer moved away, leaving Michael to digest the humiliation on his own. But Michael wasn't one to let such incidents slide without documentation. Calmly, he retrieved his phone from his pocket, ensuring the camera was discreetly aimed at the meal. He took photos of the dry bread and water, the thinly veiled mockery of it all. Michael also made sure to capture the flight attendants in the background, documenting their behavior without raising suspicion. He knew this was no isolated incident. This was a pattern he had seen before in his career, where assumptions based on his appearance led to such moments of mistreatment. This time, however, Michael was determined to use his platform and resources to ensure this behavior would not be overlooked. As the flight continued, Michael's frustration simmered beneath the surface. He was acutely aware of the crew's blatant bias, but he stayed focused on his goal to gather as much evidence as possible. He overheard snippets of conversation from the crew as they moved through the cabin, remarks that were just as pointed as the meal he had been served. "He's probably just here on a freebie," one of the attendants said. Another laughed, adding, "Guess he doesn't know how things are done up here." Michael's eyes narrowed as he recorded the comments, capturing them as evidence of the discriminatory treatment he was enduring. He realized that this wasn't just a random interaction. It was a culture of bias embedded in the airline, one that needed to be exposed, but it wasn't just the flight crew that Michael had to contend with. As he sat quietly trying to process everything, Michael noticed the passengers around him. A pair of women dressed in business attire were whispering as they passed by his seat. One of them leaned toward the other, clearly trying to be subtle, but Michael caught the tail end of their conversation. "Probably a lottery winner, or something," one of them said, her tone dripping with condescension. Michael took a deep breath, maintaining his calm demeanor. He had heard these kinds of comments before, remarks about him being out of place or not belonging in spaces like this, but this time he wasn't going to let it go unnoticed. Just then, a voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice," came a voice from the seat across the aisle. Michael turned to see Sarah, a woman in her 30s who had been sitting quietly and observing the exchange. "I don't know what's going on here, but I don't think this treatment is right." Michael looked at her, slightly surprised by her intervention. Sarah's tone was calm but firm, as if she had seen enough to know that something was wrong. She leaned across the aisle slightly, her eyes meeting his, with a mixture of sympathy and outrage. "I just wanted you to know that I see what's happening," she said, her voice soft but resolute. Michael offered her a small, appreciative nod. Thank you," he said quietly, though his mind was already racing with thoughts of how he would take action once he reached his destination. He knew that this wasn't just about one flight or one bad interaction. It was about an entire system that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Sarah smiled briefly, though her concern was still evident. "I've been watching how you've been treated, and it's wrong. If you ever need support, don't hesitate to reach out." Michael appreciated her words, but he knew the next steps were in his hands. He wasn't just going to let this slide. He had the evidence, and he had the influence to do something about it. As the flight continued, Michael remained composed. He continued documenting the situation, preparing himself for the moment when he would expose the airline's culture of discrimination. He knew it was just a matter of time before his experience became something much larger, a movement that would bring systemic change not only to the airline, but to other industries as well. For now, he sat in his seat, calmly observing the events around him, knowing that this moment would eventually fuel a much bigger conversation about equality and justice in business and beyond. The flight had just landed, but Michael Johnson's mind was far from the busy terminal in New York. As soon as the plane touched down and he made his way to the terminal, he knew that what had happened aboard the flight could not go unanswered. His experience, the dry bread and water, the biased behavior of the flight attendants, and the derogatory remarks from other passengers had left a deep impression on him. Yet it wasn't just about being personally offended. This was a pattern, one that needed to be exposed, not just for him, but for anyone who had ever faced similar mistreatment. Michael's mind quickly shifted to his next steps. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a man with a mission, determined to use his resources and skills to shed light on the issue. And in this moment, Michael knew exactly how to take action. With his background in technology, Michael was well equipped to uncover the truth. He pulled out his phone as soon as he left the airport, pulling up the airline's internal communication network, a system his company had helped integrate into the airline during a previous partnership. As a major investor, Michael had access to much more than just the typical corporate databases. He had the ability to track flights, monitor crew logs, and even pull up real-time security footage. Using his credentials, he accessed the live surveillance footage from the cabin of the flight he had just been on. The video feed played on his screen, showing the first-class cabin, and Michael meticulously went through the footage, watching the interactions between the crew and the passengers. It didn't take long before Michael found what he was looking for. There it was, Jennifer, the flight attendant, who had served him the humiliating meal, delivering it with an unmistakable attitude. He could see her face in the video, her smile forced and her movements stiff. As the footage continued, Michael noticed the same behavior repeated throughout the flight. Jennifer had been inattentive, avoiding eye contact, and even intentionally skipping over Michael when she served drinks and snacks to the rest of the passengers. As he scrolled through the footage further, Michael saw Captain Ryan, the pilot of the flight, interacting with the crew in the galley, his body language defensive as he overheard comments about Michael. The crew's dismissive attitude was palpable, and Michael could feel the sting of each glance, each unspoken judgment that had been silently passed around the cabin. Realizing he had enough evidence to prove a systematic issue within the airline, Michael immediately began compiling the footage into a report. He gathered all the screenshots, videos, and audio recordings, making sure every detail was time-stamped and properly documented. His assistant Harper had been briefed about the situation and was already waiting for his instructions. He sent the files directly to her, knowing that her next steps would be crucial. Within minutes, Harper responded, confirming that she had contacted the legal and public relations teams. She was already preparing a strategy to handle the fallout, with contingency plans to deal with both the media and the potential legal consequences. Michael felt a sense of relief wash over him, but he knew the hard work had only just begun. As Harper and the teams began to prepare for the next steps, Michael turned his attention to social media. He knew that public opinion would be a key factor in driving change. He hadn't shared the footage yet, but he had a feeling it wouldn't take long for the incident to go viral. His suspicions were confirmed when a few hours later, a passenger from the flight had already uploaded a video of the bread and water incident to Twitter. The video quickly gained traction, and by the next morning the hashtag "Bread is not service" was trending worldwide. People from all over the world shared their own experiences of being treated unfairly while flying, amplifying the conversation about discrimination in the airline industry. The hashtag became a symbol of the mistreatment faced by many, especially passengers of color, and it ignited a firestorm of public outrage. The media soon picked up on the story, with news outlets covering the incident in detail. Michael knew that the pressure was mounting on the airline, and he also knew that this was the moment when things would change. He had the evidence, he had the platform, and now he had the support of the public. The airline's reputation was quickly deteriorating as more and more passengers came forward with their own stories of mistreatment by flight attendants and other staff members. The once silent issue of discrimination in the airline industry was now being broadcast to millions, and Michael was at the forefront of it all. Meanwhile, Harper's legal team had already started preparing a formal complaint outlining the airline's failures to address systemic issues of bias and the crew members' behavior. She also made sure that PR was on top of the story, crafting a statement that would address the issue head-on and offer a transparent response to the public. As Michael sat back watching the unfolding events from his office, he felt a sense of pride mixed with determination. This was more than just about the incident on the plane. It was about changing the entire culture of an industry that had allowed this behavior to persist for too long. With the viral hashtag gaining momentum, public scrutiny was intensifying. Michael knew that the next phase would be critical. It wasn't enough to just expose the problem. He needed to ensure that the airline took meaningful action. His vision was clear. He wanted to transform the airline industry's culture from the inside out. As the pressure continued to build, Michael's resolve strengthened. The power of evidence had sparked a fire, and now it was time to turn that fire into lasting change. Michael Johnson stood in the sleek, modern conference room of his office, the early morning light filtering through the large windows as he waited for the call. His heart was calm, but his mind was a whirlwind of anticipation. The airline had already been feeling the heat from the social media firestorm, and Michael knew that now was the time to push for real change. He had spent the last few days gathering everything: the footage, the testimonies, the undeniable proof of discriminatory behavior by the flight attendants, and even Captain Ryan. It was all in his hands now, and the stakes were high. This wasn't just about the airline or his personal experience. It was about bringing accountability to an industry that had long turned a blind eye to bias. The phone rang. It was Harper. "Michael, they're ready. The executives are on the line. You've got them." Michael took a deep breath and straightened up his demeanor, composed but resolute. He knew this was the moment of reckoning, not just for the airline staff, but for an entire system that had allowed this behavior to go unchecked. He pressed a button to connect the call, and with a calm but unwavering voice addressed the room full of executives, their faces tight with unease. "Good morning, everyone," Michael began. His voice was even but carried the weight of authority that came with the undeniable evidence he had compiled. "You're all aware of the situation that unfolded during Flight 1428. What you might not be aware of, however, is that this was not an isolated incident. I've taken the liberty of gathering the evidence, security footage, audio recordings, and even testimonies from passengers. What you will see today is not just a matter of poor service, but a culture of bias that has festered unchecked in your airline for far too long." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle in. The room was silent, the tension palpable as the executives exchanged uneasy glances. Michael pressed play on his tablet, projecting the footage of Jennifer, the flight attendant, who had served him the bread and water, delivering the insult with a calculated air of superiority. He could hear the whispered remarks from the crew and passengers alike, and he knew this would leave no room for denial. One by one, he revealed the key moments, the biases, the judgments, the clear disregard for passenger dignity. "This isn't just about a meal, is it?" He continued, locking eyes with the CEO of the airline, Richard Barton. "This is about a culture that disregards people based on their appearance, their status, and yes, their race. And this culture has been allowed to persist unchecked." As the last of the footage played, the room fell into an awkward silence. Michael let the evidence speak for itself before he spoke again. "Jennifer and Captain Ryan, your staff, your leadership have failed the passengers they're meant to serve. I've made my decision, effective immediately. They are terminated." His words landed with an unmistakable finality. Jennifer and Captain Ryan sat in the back of the room, their faces ashen, unable to argue with the irrefutable proof laid out before them. Jennifer looked down. tears welling in her eyes, while Captain Ryan's face was flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. But Michael wasn't finished. "Mark," he said, turning his attention to the flight attendant who had remained silent throughout the presentation. "You, on the other hand, have shown remorse. It's clear that you recognize the severity of your actions, and I believe you can change. I'm giving you a chance to redeem yourself to show that you understand the importance of treating every passenger with dignity and respect." Mark, who had been standing in the back of the room, his posture slouched in guilt, looked up, his face a mixture of relief and shame. He nodded slowly, the weight of Michael's words sinking in. This wasn't a free pass, but a rare opportunity for redemption. Turning back to the executives, Michael's tone shifted. "This is not just about firing people. This is about changing the culture that enabled this behavior. You cannot expect a few firings to fix what's broken. I'm demanding sweeping reforms." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the executives one by one. First, mandatory bias, training for all employees from the ground crew to the flight attendants and the pilots. Second, the creation of a new department, the Passenger Equity Division, that will oversee and monitor fair treatment across all levels of the company. This division will include not just executives, but frontline workers who have experienced discrimination themselves and can speak to the challenges passengers face. He paused, letting the weight of his demands sink in. Third, he continued anonymous evaluations of service, where passengers can report discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. This will be integrated into your system and will be regularly reviewed by the new division. Michael leaned forward slightly, making sure his next words carried the full weight of his intention. "If you are serious about making this change, it needs to come from the top. No more lip service, no more token diversity initiatives. I want real systemic reform. If this company is going to survive, it will need to change how it treats everyone regardless of their background. It starts with you, and it starts today." The silence that followed was heavy as the executives absorbed the scope of Michael's demands. Richard Barton, the CEO, was the first to break the silence, his voice tight with resignation. "We understand, Michael. We will implement the changes you've outlined, but this will take time." Michael's response was firm, but not unkind. "Time is exactly what we don't have. The industry is changing, and if you don't change with it, you'll be left behind. This is your chance to lead the way or to be left in the dust." As the meeting concluded, Michael felt a sense of both satisfaction and anticipation. This was just the beginning of the change he had set in motion, but the real work was only starting. He knew that pushing for these reforms would be a long and difficult battle, but Michael had never backed down from a challenge before. The aftermath of this incident would be felt throughout the entire airline industry, and he was ready to see it through to the end. He turned to Harper, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the meeting. "Make sure the legal team is ready. We're not done yet," he said. "This is just the first step in making sure this never happens again." As the executives left the room, Michael remained behind his thoughts, already on the next phase of the battle. The fight for fairness, for equality, and for justice was far from over. But Michael had just delivered a blow that would be remembered for a long time. The culture of the airline and the industry as a whole would never be the same again. In the days following the confrontation at the airline's headquarters, Michael Johnson's focus shifted from private meetings to the public eye. The viral social media frenzy had only intensified, and now, with the power of evidence and the backing of public opinion, Michael knew he had the momentum to enact real change. He had already secured the termination of the crew members involved in his mistreatment, but now it was time to push for broader reform. He understood that this wasn't just about one flight or one airline, it was about something much larger, something deeply embedded in the fabric of the airline industry itself. Michael knew that the only way to create lasting change was to expose the system that allowed such discrimination to persist and turn it into a nationwide conversation. The day arrived for the press conference, and Michael stood at the podium with an unwavering calm. The room was filled with journalists, media representatives, and industry experts, all eager to hear what the man at the center of this controversy had to say. Michael took a deep breath, glanced at the room of reporters, and then began. What happened on my flight was not an isolated incident. He began, his voice firm, yet filled with a quiet power. It is a reflection of a deeper systemic issue in the airline industry. What was done to me, though, personally painful, is something that countless passengers experience every day, though many don't have the platform or resources to bring it to light. Michael's words resonated across the room, and he could feel the weight of their significance. This isn't just about a slice of bread and a cup of water. He continued, his gaze steady. This is about a culture that devalues certain passengers based on preconceived notions about their worth. It's about a system that assumes who belongs and who doesn't, based on how you look, what you wear, or where you come from. This behavior is not just wrong, it's unacceptable, and it has to change. The room was silent as his words sunk in the gravity of the situation, becoming crystal clear to everyone present. Effective immediately. Michael said, his tone resolute. I'm pushing for a set of reforms that will address this issue head-on. First, we're implementing anonymous flight evaluations for all passengers. This will ensure that any discriminatory behavior can be reported without fear of retaliation. Second, there will be mandatory bias training for all staff, flight attendants, pilots, ground crew, everyone. No one will be exempt. And finally, we will create a new department, the Passenger Equity Division. This division will be responsible for overseeing fair treatment for all passengers and will include individuals who have experienced discrimination themselves, ensuring that the airline truly understands the challenges people face. Michael paused for a moment, allowing the room to absorb the weight of his words. These changes are not negotiable. They are a first step in a long journey toward a more equitable and just airline industry. As he finished his speech, the room erupted into a flurry of questions from reporters, but Michael remained calm, answering each inquiry with clarity and purpose. He could feel the energy shift in the room. The narrative was no longer just about the incident on the plane. It had become a movement for change, one that had gained momentum and was now impossible to ignore. Michael's actions had sparked a much-needed conversation about the pervasive nature of bias in the airline industry, and he knew that this was only the beginning. The press coverage and social media buzz around the conference were undeniable, and the airline was now under intense scrutiny. But Michael was ready for the long road ahead, knowing that meaningful change never comes easily. In the days that followed, Michael's stance on the issue became clearer and more widely accepted. People from all walks of life, from passengers who had experienced discrimination to employees who had witnessed it, rallied around his cause. Michael's call for action had become a call for accountability, and it was resonating far beyond the walls of the press conference. The hashtag #unequality in the air began to trend, and more stories of discrimination came pouring in. People who had once remained silent now found their voices empowered by Michael's courage to speak out. His efforts were not just about fixing one airline's culture, they were about challenging an entire industry to confront its biases head-on. The airline, facing mounting pressure, had no choice but to follow through on the changes Michael had demanded. The new training programs were rolled out across the company, and the anonymous evaluation system began to take shape. Passengers began to feel the difference. Staff were more attentive, more respectful, and more conscious of their actions. While there was still a long way to go, the visible shift in the airline's attitude was undeniable. Michael had become not just a business leader, but a symbol of what could be achieved when individuals stood up against injustice. But Michael didn't stop there. He began to meet with other leaders in the industry, using his platform to push for change on a larger scale. He worked with other CEOs to establish industry-wide standards for diversity, equity, and inclusion in air travel. Michael knew that this fight wasn't over and that it would take years of continued effort to create a truly inclusive environment for all passengers. But what he had started was the beginning of a culture shift that would reverberate through the airline industry for decades to come. And in the process, Michael Johnson had not only changed the way airlines operated, he had changed the way we all think about fairness and dignity in travel. As the months passed, Michael's efforts continued to inspire others. His name became synonymous with accountability and progress, and his story was used as a case study in corporate ethics and diversity training worldwide. The shift he had sparked in the airline industry spread to other sectors, creating a ripple effect that reached far beyond the confines of air travel. Michael's journey had begun with one moment of injustice, but it had led to a movement that transformed an entire industry, and in doing so had set a powerful example for what could be achieved when individuals refused to remain silent in the face of discrimination. The change Michael had championed was not just about policies or procedures. It was about shifting the culture, ensuring that every passenger, regardless of their background, was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. And in that, Michael had truly made history. If you're inspired by the changes we've discussed today and want to continue following stories that drive real transformation, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Inside HQ. Join us for more captivating content that challenges the status quo, exposes systemic issues, and showcases the powerful stories of individuals standing up for what's right. Share your thoughts in the comments and become a part of the movement pushing for accountability, fairness, and lasting change across industries. Stay tuned for more thought-provoking stories that will keep you engaged, informed, and motivated to take action. Subscribe now, and let's shape the future together.